Hello everyone, Leafread here, and today we have Arsene Lupin, The Gentleman Burglar by Maurice Leblanc. Now, kind of jumping off my current Persona analysis and run, and after just beating Persona 5, again, I really use games sometimes as a medium if I'm really interested in the characters and setting and style of it. Then I try to find, the root idea that the developer, in this case, based their idea off of. And so I just kind of wanted more Persona 5, I guess. And so I decided to finally read Lupin. There's also a, very apparently, quite famous anime about Lupin as well, Lupin the Third. Well, I should read that and watch that at some point. But right now I'm just kind of reading the original literature. And it is interesting. Of course, you'll see that Arsene, of course, is the name of, the persona, the main persona you get in Persona 5. And Lupin is a more common term. That's definitely the name of the anime and other kinds of shows and spin-offs, which is interesting that they never acknowledge the first name. And of course, you notice that the author's last name, Leblanc, is the name of the cafe in Persona 5 as well. So as soon as I saw that, I'm like, okay, I need to read this, essentially, in order to get more context. And it's a very fun book. This was written at the turn of the century, 1905. And really, it's a series of short stories that Maurice was writing. It's actually a funny story. He was a journalist, and he was asked on the fly, off the cuff, essentially, to write a series of short stories about a gentleman thief. And the whole idea, or at least what became the idea, is that this is the counterpart to Sherlock Holmes. So instead of a gentleman savant detective, you have a gentleman savant thief. And so you'll find a lot of the things in this book are just very witty, very funny. For example, a common trope that you'll find throughout this novel is that Arsene will basically steal something from the chief of police or the main person pursuing him, and he'll return it as a sign of getting the better of them. So Arsene is kind of like a high-class, witty, kind of jokester, like literally a Joker kind of character, in the sense that he just likes to have fun more than he wants to actually get the treasure. If he can get back at someone or do something absolutely ridiculous, he will. So some of the short stories in this book, and I think there are other books in this, but the book itself is divided into fairly decent size font, and it's just a series of short stories that kind of open and close. And each one of them, they all take place in a non-chronological order, which honestly feels very appropriate. There are certain stories where, it starts with a premise. There's like some jewel or some famous painting or something, and then it goes into the characters and, how they, prize this possession, and then it flows into essentially, somehow Lupin, fits into the narrative of the story, and each short story tells us something more about Lupin as a character, which I think is really interesting. So there's one episode where you have the introduction to Lupin, you have his origin story, you have his coming of age story, you have his love interest story, you have his rival story, and so all these characters that kind of emerge and don't have any direct relation to Lupin all connect to him by the end of the book. Really, really interesting read and really fun to read, honestly. And it does feel almost kind of like an anime, the way it's laid out. Like, it has just certain tropes, like, oh yeah, this is the origin story, this is the origin arc for this character, or this is, the creation of his rival. And I'll kind of spoil it, but the recurring theme and trope that Maurice uses throughout this book that is very, very witty and kind of genius, but is really only possible through the medium of literature and books rather than TV, is that the narration will take place between a series of characters or a main character, but the big twist at the end of 90% of all these short stories is that Lupin is actually the narrator. He's actually the narrator, in another disguise, as he's a chief of police, or he's like a rich lord or something, called Monsieur Bardonneau or something. And it turns out at the end he's like, indeed, for it was I, Arsene Lupin, this whole time. And you're like, he got me again. And like, it always happens. And sometimes he's not even the main character. Sometimes he's like a sub character or side character, but it always is a thing that he reveals himself to be one of the characters in the story, that it just is a total master of disguise. And of course the issue is with the medium of a visual medium of anime and TV and whatever. It's kind of easy to tell visually, oh, that guy's obviously whatever. So I do think there is some benefit to reading this over other Lupin properties, because you're just never quite sure if it's the same guy. And so if I can just recall some of the chapters and give an oversight of the different things. And I just love the first story in here. It's called The Arrest of Arsene Lupin. So it already like gives you this kind of hook where it's like, oh, it's already over. And so the first story takes place on a shipliner going from France to America. And there's, they receive a telegram essentially saying that Arsene Lupin is on board, and he's under the alias, and before it can finish sending the name of the alias, it just has one letter, which is R. And so the people, it's almost like a murder mystery, but no one gets murdered. And what's really funny is that in that story, you can see how he's a gentleman burglar, because what happens is there's someone who is falsely accused, and everyone's ganging up on him and making his life miserable. And out of pity, Lupin actually ties him up and kidnaps him and hangs him dangling from part of the deck, while he also returns one of the missing items to like the vice captain or something. So he kind of exonerates him by doing crime against him and also returning one of the items. So this is what they mean he's a gentleman burglar, where he's very fair in a certain way, and he's more interested in playing a joke and a trick on people more so than actually taking their belongings. But of course he's always after the money, regardless. There's also the origin story where he was a small child and talks about his family and his upbringing, and how he grew up destitute basically. And he basically has not exactly a Monte Cristo revenge story. It's more so he has his revenge, but it's such in a sophisticated manner where he doesn't have to. It's like he's already committed the crime, and then out of like politeness, he goes in disguise to the person he did the crime at like a decade ago, and basically reveals to them through a hypothetical story, what actually happened. And it was a really cool thing. Arsene Lupin in prison. So there's another thing where he makes this great escape from the prison in Paris, and then he demands to be let back in. And another thing that keeps occurring is, of course, Arsene Lupin. He's always this master of disguise, basically. And so he's always able to, again, mask himself or use, extreme measures to actually mask who he is. Sometimes he can actually act his way, sometimes out of people guessing who he really is. And of course, Arsene Lupin is just a moniker that he made up on the fly. And unlike some other origin story, he just seems to come up with it on the spot. He doesn't really have this whole thing where he sees some advertisement and makes something up. He just comes up with it on the spot as just whatever. So the meaning behind the name Arsene Lupin is just whatever. It's just the nomenclature. Probably my favorite arc and part of this story is near the end, where it's funny, in the beginning, in the very first story, Arsene, under the guise of this other gentleman, he meets this girl called Miss Nellie, and he kind of falls in love with her. And it's not until near the end of the book, he ends up robbing this place, and it turns out she's the one living there with, and she's been married at this point. And so he's so crestfallen that, she's no longer available, and that he accidentally raided, her house and put her kind of in harm's way to a degree. And he's so remorseful that he returns everything in this kind of grand fashion. But there's one thing about, stealing all these, Louis XVI chairs, the Queen's necklace, a bunch of paintings. There's this whole side story about, there's actually the most interesting story of, usually he's stealing valuables or, very important, pieces of jewelry. But there's one side story that is just very much of the time where he steals, like government military documents on the engineering schematics for the new type of naval submarine. And you have to remember, at this time, 1905, with World War I on the horizon, almost less than a decade later, the main technological superweapon of that time was essentially the dreadnought, and by extension, U-boats and submarines. And so it's just kind of an interesting thing that, if there was a modern day thriller spy movie, it might be about like a stealth fighter plane, or in James Bond, it's like a new kind of nuke or a new kind of missile device or some kind of laser in space. But appropriately, it's a submarine schematics, in 1905, which I think is just very cool because it has the same kind of energy to it. Again, it's very nice the way the book is written. A lot of it is, a description of, the setting, the area, Lupin's thought process, and then there'll be sections where it's just dialogue back and forth without really, anyone saying he said, she said. It's like, line, response, line, response, etc. And again, there's always so many times where Lupin is master of disguise, and the character that you think is completely original is actually him, or it's someone else in disguise, which is very interesting. It's funny, the last chapter in this book, it does involve a crossover with Sherlock Holmes, who basically appears and kind of deduces this kind of video game-esque mechanism where you have to put this thing in the wall and pull a lever and then, shift the words around so it spells out something, and it reveals a hidden granite passageway, underneath the ruins of this church to this manor. And they kind of have this little rivalry, and what I love actually is the way it ends, because it ends with Lupin he's already gotten away, but he kind of leaves instructions under his alias for this person to bring the automobile to Sherlock Holmes, because he would deduce when he would finish his investigation and find the secret passage. And so when Sherlock finds the secret passage, he also finds Lupin's note along with Sherlock's own pocket watch, which he stole. So it's kind of like, it's more important for Lupin to get the better of someone else and to outwit them rather than to simply just take stuff. It reminds me a little bit, in a way, I guess, of Death Note in that sense, where it's really a battle of wits and outsmarting your enemy rather than just winning for the sake of winning. I think it's just really cool. Also, I want to read this part because it's very a straightforward book, but he's talking about how he encounters Miss Nellie at the end of the book and how he feels about her and how he realizes he can never be with her. And I just found this very poetic, so I'm just going to read it. A cloud obscured the sun. Arsene Lupin stood watching the imprints of her tiny feet in the sand. Suddenly he gave a start. Upon the box which contained the bamboo, beside which Nellie had been standing, he saw the rose, the white rose, which he had desired but dared not ask for. Forgotten, no doubt, it also. But how designedly, or through distraction, he seized it eagerly. Some of its petals fell to the ground. He picked them up one by one, like precious relics. I don't know, that just really blew me away, and everything that's just more thriller-based. What's also very funny is that by the end of this book, they kind of tease the sequel, or what Maurice would go on to write. And I guess because of some weird copyright issue, at the time, because obviously Sherlock Holmes came first. Um, well, they call him Sherlock Holmes in the entire short story, but at the very end, the title of the next book, which they're previewing, is called Sherlock Holmes, and I'm not making it up. It's right there. So I found that very amusing. But yeah, this was a really fun book. I think the one really funny part that I think I'll just end on is about LeBlanc, kind of this intro part here, and about Conan Doyle, is that both of them wrote or started writing these short stories as just, fun or whatever, for exercise. And maybe I'll just read this out loud because it's very funny. Conan Doyle, who often appeared embarrassed or hindered by the success of Sherlock Holmes, and seemed to regard his success in the field of crime fiction as a detraction from his more respectable literary ambitions. LeBlanc also appeared to have resented Lupin's success. Several times he tried to create other characters, such as Private Eye Jim Barnett, but eventually merged them with Lupin. He continued to pen Lupin tales well into the 1930s. So I find it very funny and interesting that both these crime fiction writers kind of resented their own work for being unsophisticated, which is, I don't know, that's just really funny to me as a lasting note, essentially, that they're really good at something, but they wish they weren't. They're kind of like the equivalent of, I don't know, YouTubers or reviewers or something who wanted to do something really serious with their time, but ended up making skippy toilet videos. I don't know. Anyway, it was really fun reading this, honestly. I didn't really get a lot of notes, into Persona 5 or any, bridges of dialogue. I think it is really cool how it does the whole shifting of perspective, how the character is able to adapt to different identities. I think they try to bring that into Persona 5, where you have the whole mask mechanic, where it'd be really cool that, yeah, you can change your persona based on who you're talking to and what your situation is and your battle, but there's never like a disguise mechanic in the game. You can hide and creep around, but there's never like a thing where you actually make a disguise for yourself, where you fool the target into who you are. The other thing I just got too is that if we're actually to compare Arsene Lupin to Joker from Persona 5, they are completely different characters. They are not alike at all. Arsene Lupin is more like, I know, he's just kind of like a Joker kind of character, and like a jester kind of character, and the main character in Persona 5, Joker, he's basically just like this oppressed kid. He's just kind of very, he's very, he's supposed to be like a fill-in for the player, so he's kind of intentionally kind of bland. He does have, some personality traits where he is able to, talk to other characters and act as a foil to them and basically say, we're going to take out this guy, but he doesn't really have a Joker-like nature to his character. There's never a time when he really, I fooled you and this is how we're going to do it. It's kind of like, appropriately, that all the other characters surrounding the main character in Persona games are the ones with the actual writing, where you just, they just give you a vehicle to experience all of that. But yeah, again, really not a lot of, implementations or relative things to Persona 5. And obviously, influenced it and helped create this image, but it's a very different piece of media. But I really liked it, actually. I was really surprised by how fun and nice it was to read this book by LeBlanc, and so I'm glad that Persona 5 led me to this. Anyway, guys, that's pretty much all I got to say about the novel, and yeah, I guess that's it. And as always, keep reading. I'll see you later.